People usually think that the cooperation between the US and the Soviet Union in the automotive industry was one-sided. The US sold cars, technology, and licenses to the USSR. Sometimes the Soviets just copied American designs. And of course, there was the Lend-Lease. But there was more to this story than that. Sending Soviet cars to the US. And the most interesting and dramatic part of the story was when a Soviet car suddenly became the center of a spy scandal, even though it had nothing to do with it. But let's go through it one step at a time. We know exactly when the first Soviet cars came to the United States. It happened in the last part of 1933. And no, they weren't Moskviches. Two cars from the Gorky car factory made it across the Atlantic. The Gazafetan and the Gaz AA truck are basically licensed copies of the Ford Model A and Model A. They didn't come to Ford Motor Company as exports. They came to study technology under an existing contract. So, the first time the Soviet auto industry came to the US was for technical reasons, not to try to break into the market. A few years later, the same thing happened again. In the late 1930s, a ZIS 101 luxury limousine was sent to the US to be used by the Soviet embassy. The American press did notice it, but this was another demonstration, not a business effort. Henry Ford II gave a pretty harsh review of another Soviet limousine, the ZIS 110. Later in 1954, he said, "We were making cars like this about 20 years ago." That comment made the news, and interestingly, the Soviet side didn't argue with it. Konstantin Pavlov, the director of the exhibition, wrote in the official report after the show, "Showing old models does nothing but harm." Moskviches were the first Soviet cars to be sold outside of the country. By the end of the 1950s and the beginning of the 1960s, Moskvich cars were being sent to 36 countries, such as Belgium, Finland, and Scandinavia. British journalists got their hands on the Moskvich 402 as early as 1957. A Norwegian sailor visiting a friend brought the Soviet car to the UK. The car caught people's attention, so reporters decided to look more closely. Their evaluation was pretty fair. The car was described by journalists as simple and easy to drive, with good grip, well-designed synchronizers, decent lighting, and precise steering. They said that the suspension made for a smooth ride on bad roads. At the same time, they said directly that the car's interior finish and performance were not good enough for the average British buyer. And yes, the Moskvich 402's performance was its weakest point. The car had a small 35 horsepower engine that could only go 105 km/h. The manufacturer did not measure or officially say how long it took to go from a stop to 100 km/h. The Soviet side knew very well that the British press's conclusions made perfect sense. That's why the Moskvich 402 wasn't sold very often. It just couldn't compete with similar products from the West. The new model, the Moskvich 407, changed things. This version was better for markets outside of the US and became the main export model. There were big changes behind the scenes. The new overhead valve engine made 50 horsepower, and the top speed went up to 115 km/h. It seems that this information was not made public because it was not seen as very important at the time. Still, the Moskvich 407 did well in other countries. For example, in Belgium, the company's Scaldia Volga sold Moskvich cars, sometimes with its own trim and detailing. It also got knockdown kits from Moscow to put in 1.6 L Perkins diesel engines with 43 horsepower. There are two main stories about how Moskvich got to the United States. It's hard to say which one is right, so it makes sense to talk about both and let the viewer decide. The first version says that the story started in 1959 when Nikita Khrushchev and Dwight Eisenhower met. Eisenhower is said to have said during a casual chat that it might be a good idea to sell Soviet cars in the US. The Moscow small car plant, also known as the Moskvich plant, was then told to get a batch of Moskvich 407 cars ready for sale in the United States. The second version tells a different story. Robert Joseph Castle, a businessman from the small city of Syracuse, New York, saw the Moskvich 407 for the first time at the London Motor Show in 1958. He thought the car could make money, so he decided to try selling it in the United States. The first Soviet-American trade agreement for the sale of passenger cars and spare parts to the U.S. was signed in February 1960. The two-year contract said that 10,000 Moskvich cars would be brought in. What did the young American really expect when he chose to sell Moskvich cars in the U.S.? In the early 1960s, the American car market was very different from the Soviet one. Big land yachts with velour couches, air conditioning, and a lot of comfort. European cars look pale next to that, not to mention a Soviet Moskvich. At the same time, the U.S. market for compact cars was still mostly undeveloped. Robert Castle wanted to get into that niche. The Moskvich wasn't really small by American standards. It was more like a microcar. The Rambler American, which did pretty well on the market, was thought to be small in the U.S., but was already in the mid-size class by European standards. In the U.S., about 700,000 imported passenger cars were sold each year, so selling 10,000 Moskvich cars didn't seem like too much. The only thing left to do was to offer a good price, since price had often been the main reason why Soviet cars did well in other countries. This is where things started to go wrong. When you brought a car from the Soviet Union into the U.S., you had to pay a 10% import duty. For cars from other countries, the duty was only 8.5%. Import taxes on spare parts were even higher, 25% instead of 10.5%. On top of that, there are complicated logistics. Because of this, the cost of a Moscow in the US rose to about $1,800. That cost a lot. A 1960 Rambler American cost $1,795 and had more features. It was also in a different class. Castle still didn't think this was a deal breaker. He thought he would find buyers, even those who were interested in strange and unique cars. The first shipment, which was about 100 Moskvich cars, had already made it to the US. There were 500 more on the way. Then, on May 1, 1960, an American Lockheed U-2 reconnaissance plane took off from a U.S. airbase in Pakistan early that morning. Francis Powers was the pilot. The flight was supposed to end in Norway, but it went right over the Soviet Union. The flight's goal was to take pictures of Soviet military and nuclear sites from the air. The U-2 flew at heights of 20 to 21 kilometers, which were thought to be unreachable by Soviet air defense systems in the mid-1950s. That idea turned out to be a deadly error. At 5:36 p.m. local time, the plane crossed the border into the Soviet Union. The S-75 Dana surface-to-air missile system shot down the U-2 at 8:53 near Sverdlovsk. The strike hit the back of the plane, but the cockpit stayed mostly intact. Powers was able to get out of the plane and parachute to safety. After he landed, people in the area held him near the wreckage. Official reports say that he had a silenced pistol, a hunting knife, an inflatable life raft, food and water, signal flares, a compass, Soviet rubles, gold rings, and several gold watches. He also had a hollow $1 coin with a poison needle, an explosive device, and a silk banner with a message in 14 languages. "I have no bad feelings toward your people. You will be rewarded if you help me." There is still some debate about whether this inventory was a true picture of reality or was partly influenced by Soviet investigators. They took Powers to Moscow, where they questioned him and put him in jail. The U.S. government said on May 3rd that the U-2 was part of a program to study weather conditions in the upper atmosphere. One of these planes went missing on May 1st after the pilot said there were problems with the oxygen system while flying over Turkey. The downed plane, on the other hand, survived the fall surprisingly well, including most of its internal equipment, which the Soviet side was able to show to the public. The results of the event were not good. Eisenhower, Khrushchev, and the leaders of the UK and France were supposed to meet in Paris in May 1960. There were talks about nuclear disarmament, limits on weapons testing, and a general easing of tensions on the agenda. Khrushchev asked Eisenhower to apologize in public and promised that these flights would stop. Eisenhower admitted to the spying flights, but wouldn't say sorry. The summit fell apart, And instead of Dayton, a new phase of conflict began. Francis Powers was given a 10-year prison sentence for spying. Because of this, it was almost impossible to sell Moskvich cars in the United States. The Secretary of Commerce in the U.S. said that Soviet cars would not be allowed to be sold in the U.S. At the same time, there were already about 100 Moskvich cars in the U.S. And a ship carrying about 500 more cars to the U.S. was turned back. Robert Castle said, "The Moskviches will just sit there until Khrushchev lets Powers go home in one of them." Soon, the American press called Castle a victim of the Cold War. It was also clear that the Moskvich cars' glass, bumpers, and lights did not meet U.S. safety standards. There is only solid proof that 3 sold vehicles exist. The rest were probably sent back to the Soviet Union or sent to Europe, where they were sold through local dealers. But at least one of those cars, the Texas Moskvich, became famous in some circles. A strange, partially disassembled car of unknown origin showed up at an American scrapyard in the late 1960s. The owner of the scrapyard, Bev Kidwell, was so curious that she decided to put the car back together and take it for a drive before sending it to the crusher. He was interested in the car for some reason, and it never went under the press. Kidwell was able to get the paperwork and buy the car from the state for only $35 thanks to a friend who worked at the Department of Motor Vehicles. Later, dock workers recognized the car and told Bev about a failed attempt to send Soviet cars to the U.S. The captain of a Soviet cargo ship saw the Moskvich again and tried to buy it, but he couldn't. He did, however, tell the captain what the car was really called, because the papers had a strange name for it, and also gave Bev a set of metric tools. Bev didn't have enough money to fully restore the Moskvich, so it sat in a remote part of the junkyard for almost 20 years. Not running, but not being scrapped either. Kidwell put an ad in the paper in 1982 saying the car was for sale. Gary Bricken, a collector and expert on Soviet cars, saw it and bought it for $300. He then drove it to Texas. It was hard to restore. Gary didn't have any spare parts, manuals, or diagrams. You couldn't find them in the US, they were hard to get in Europe, and they were almost impossible to get in the Soviet Union. At one point, he wrote an emotional letter to Leonid Brev, in which he talked about promises made by Auto Export to help Soviet car owners, no matter where they are. After that, a shipment came in that no one expected. It had important spare parts, paperwork, and later a full set of new tires. Everything was given away for free. Gary spent about $4,400 to buy and fix it up. He called his Moskvich Son of Moscow. About $127,000 worth of Moskvich cars were sent to other countries between 1959 and 1963, 42% of all production. With this in mind, the 10,000 cars planned for the U.S. market didn't make a big difference. It was still a real chance for the U.S. and the Soviet Union to work together and for their relations to get back to normal. On February 10, 1962, in Berlin on the Glica Bridge, Francis Gary Powers was traded for William Pfizer, a Soviet spy better known as Rudolf A.L. Thanks for staying with us until the end. Please remember to leave a comment. It's the best way to help the channel. I'll see you next time with more interesting stories.